You're in the water loop.
Waterloop episode number 126, Getting Schooled in Freshwater. The Great Lakes are the largest freshwater ecosystem in the world, containing over 20% of Earth's surface freshwater. This makes the Great Lakes an incredibly unique and critical place for water research, including in the areas of invasive species, microplastics, emerging contaminants, and climate change. The opportunities to learn and devise solutions for water challenges is discussed in this episode with Rebecca Klaper, the Vice Dean of the School of Freshwater Sciences at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Rebecca also talks about how the university attracts students from a wide range of backgrounds who then go into a diversity of fields after graduation, highlighting the cross-disciplinary nature of water. Before starting the conversation, a few reminders. Waterloop is a nonprofit media outlet that depends on a variety of support. That includes you as a listener. If you value Waterloop's content, consider making a contribution through Patreon. Patrons support podcast production, join exclusive Q&A sessions with guests, suggest topics for coverage, get shout-outs, and receive merchandise. Visit patreon.com/thewaterloop. Waterloop is made possible in part by a grant from Springpoint Partners. We are very grateful for the Foundation's vital support. Waterloop is also sponsored by Hydroloop, a company that is revolutionizing gray water recycling in homes and businesses. Waterloop. It's time for bold leadership when it comes to advancing water sustainability. Let's look at the example set by Sydney, Australia. The city saw that it was time to adapt, and it cleared the way for residential gray water recycling, allowing homeowners to clean and reuse water in their homes. Enter the perfect solution, Hydroloop. It's a water recycling system that takes the water from showers and washing machines and cleans it so it can be used again for toilets, washing machines, garden irrigation, and more. The Hydroloop technology can make a massive difference for water sustainability in countries around the world, including in the United States. Sydney is showing what is possible by empowering residents to recycle water. With Hydroloop, you can use water twice. Learn more at hydroloop.com.
You're in the water loop.
Hi, welcome to Waterloop. This is Travis. Excited for this episode to talk with Rebecca Klaper. She is Vice Dean of the School of Freshwater Sciences at the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee. Rebecca, thanks for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
Yeah, like I was saying kind of before we started recording, I've known about that School of Freshwater Sciences for a number of years. People speak so highly of it. You all have an incredible mission and work that you do up there that we'll talk about. So I'm really glad to connect. And I was saying I want to have more Great Lakes kind of content on the podcast. So this is a good step in that direction.
Even better.
Yeah. Before we kind of dig into maybe some of the issues and into the nuts and bolts a little bit, could you tell people what the University of Wisconsin-Milwaukee School of Freshwater Sciences is?
Yeah, we are the first graduate school of freshwater sciences located on one of the Great Lakes in the United States. We are right now, we started as a graduate school, but we are just starting our new undergraduate program this year as well. We have scientists that research everything from aquaculture, how to sustainably raise fish in a time where fish populations are dwindling, even though they're a main food source for many people, to water technologies for cleanup, for sensing, to areas like my own research where we're looking at contaminants and how they impact not only the organisms that we find in freshwater systems and those communities and ecosystems, but also how that relates to human health. The whole idea of One Health, that the environmental health is tied to human health. And then we also have people studying ecosystem science, how the freshwater sciences operate, how things like the Great Lakes operate. And then we also have a great scientist, a couple scientists looking at bacteria and viral populations in our freshwater environments, including the latest thing being monitoring COVID in our wastewater systems. What's being emitted from our wastewater systems after many of our populations are being exposed to things like COVID.
Yeah, you have a lot going on then, a lot of different angles here. What's it just like being, a scientist like yourself, being located there on the largest freshwater ecosystem in the world and just delving into all that science? What's that just like?
Yeah, Milwaukee's in a great position because we're at the confluence of three rivers, the Milwaukee, the Menominee, and the Kinnickinnic River that end up emptying out into Lake Michigan. And, historically, this was an area where Native Americans were really dependent on the water systems and have a deep connection to water and the things they were able to grow here and the fish on these lakes. So we're very cognizant of the fact that we are standing on the shoulders of other folks that had a great appreciation for this freshwater system. And we are really lucky in the fact that we can just step out our door and onto our boat and into these freshwater systems and study them on a daily basis. And so it's a pretty exciting place to be. We also have a great facility. And because we're basically right on the water, we can bring samples back and analyze them right away in our facility. We have a great group of scientists and undergraduates and graduate students and technicians in our building that everyone can interact with each other and learn from each other about these very diverse areas of freshwater science. And that also includes, you think of freshwater scientists being just those folks that go out and study the birds and bunnies of the water world, different fish and organisms in water systems. But we also have folks that study economics and policy and legal aspects of our freshwater resources, which is really unusual for a science school. And it is one of our sources of pride in the fact that we have brought in some of the social sciences to help us answer questions about how humans relate to their environment.
Awesome. So in short, it's really cool being located there. Yeah.
Short answer, very awesome place. Yeah.
Why are the Great Lakes and where you're located, why is this an important place for water research to be happening? I'd love to really kind of get your perspective on that.
The Great Lakes are a huge freshwater resource for many populations in the United States. And it is, they're like freshwater oceans is the closest thing that you can describe them as. Anyone that's from another part of the country, if you come to one of the Great Lakes, I think you're surprised about their size. They're ginormous pieces of water. And they're just amazing in their scope. And so we really think of them more as oceans rather than what anyone would think of a lake being in, one of the other states that's not connected to the Great Lakes. So they're an important source of fresh water, drinking water for not only for human populations, but also for industry. There are lots of industries that are located on the Great Lakes because of this great water source. Of course, in Milwaukee, we're a beer making town and also have Harley and some other industries, Badger Meter and other industries that are associated with water, either dependent on the water resource or have built up here. In fact, Milwaukee is becoming a freshwater science hub for industry and commercial enterprises, partly because of an organization that started here, the Water Council, many years ago, about the same time our school started, and really putting forth the fact that fresh water is very important for a lot of reasons. And so this is the place to be. We're on this huge freshwater resource where we can have water as a focus in our discussions of not only the environment and populations, but also for industry.
I love that you describe the Great Lakes as more like these oceans than lakes. That's a really cool way to explain it. When I've flown over the area or flown into the area, they are massive. The other thing that always surprises me is the color. Like, you're kind of used to these muddy looking lakes, and just the color of blue that they pop with is amazing sometimes. All right. So all the science that you all are doing, what's the science saying about the health of the Great Lakes? The science you all do. What are some of like the big, takeaways right now?
Yeah, actually, the example that you gave just now about how the lakes look is really a prime example. The lakes, a couple decades ago, looked a lot different than they do right now.
Mm.
Lake Michigan, as you said, looks like the Caribbean when you fly over it now, and it didn't used to look like that. It used to be much less clear,
Mm.
much less blue, and just to the naked eye, it looks beautiful now. Maybe it's cleaned up or something. But actually, what happened is that we have several invasive species, quagga mussels and zebra mussels that have invaded our Great Lakes. And in Lake Michigan in particular, they have cleaned up some of the bottom of the food web to the point where it's harming some of the creatures that are reliant on those little critters that are swimming around in the lake. And so it's cleared up the water column and created other problems like algal growth, where light penetrates deeper down into the water column and ends up instigating algae growing where they weren't before, and causes changes in ecosystem dynamics. And so invasive species are one that have had a tremendous impact over the last several decades, and is definitely still of concern within the Great Lakes, whether it's quagga mussels and zebra mussels or some of the fish species that have been introduced. And that brings me to one of the things that the reasons why the Great Lakes are also important is shipping. And I didn't mention that before, but we use the Great Lakes as a conveyance system for our goods and things that we're transporting around the Great Lakes region from other parts of the world. And with that, they sometimes bring in other critters that are not necessarily beneficial for our Great Lakes ecosystem.
Yeah. Wow. Two of the other things I hear often are associated with the Great Lakes are microplastics. I've heard about that being an issue. Is that something that your science is looking at, or that you're, obviously aware of?
Yeah. And, that was one of the things. I think we had known that there were, plastics out in ocean systems for a while. The microplastics issue really hit with an article that was published here on the Great Lakes, where they found these little bits of plastics, either things that had broken down or things that had been in our cosmetic products in different parts of the lake. And we're learning more now that especially as there was such an emphasis before on plastics that came out of our cosmetics, the scrubbers, little plastic beads that had been put in for exfoliation or for looks, and people being afraid that those were what was ending up out in the lake. And what we're finding now is that there's diversity of plastics that end up out there, or things that are polymers, including things like shredded up tires, fibers from our clothing that end up washing out and into our laundry and into the sewage treatment plant, which is not designed to take those things out, and end up out in the environment. And so it is an issue. There's still a question as to how much of an impact it's causing on freshwater systems. And so I think that's still one of the big question marks. The fact that we are finding those little plastics often out in freshwater environments is definitely raising that to a level of concern.
Hmm. And the other thing I wanted to ask about, because I see articles about climate change in the Great Lakes. We hear so much about the drought in the West, and here on the East Coast, we've got like a lot of intense rainfall and hurricanes, and there's flooding that happens in the middle of the country. I'm just curious kind of what the science is saying about the Great Lakes and if climate impacts.
Yeah, in fact, we have a position open right now for a climate scientist to join our ranks, because we know this is important. We've had several scientists that have been studying this for, again, a couple of decades. In fact, we just absorbed into our school the atmospheric sciences department, because we know there's such a strong connection between atmospheric science and what happens in our Great Lakes systems. There have definitely been changes in water patterns, for instance, in Green Bay, which is up to the north of us. We have several scientists that study Green Bay ecosystem, which is part of the Great Lakes. And we know that there have been changes in water movement and in temperature and in the organisms that are able to survive and thrive in Green Bay because of climate change. And we also see changes in the big thing about climate change is the variability that happens in our weather patterns. And what we have seen in the Milwaukee area and in other places surrounding the Great Lakes is that variability is really influencing how much washes into the lakes, how much water flow sewage treatment systems have to deal with, our infrastructure has to deal with. We see differences in ice cover on the lakes, which also helps to determine water levels in the lake. And again, it's not necessarily that one year we see this tremendous change and it keeps growing. It's the variability that happens is becoming more unpredictable and greater cycles, so that it's influencing how dynamic that system is and influencing them, the whole ecosystem because of it.
Yeah, interesting. I think when you were talking about the School of Freshwater Sciences in the beginning of our conversation, you did rattle off some different areas of research and things you do. Are there any other leading areas of research you have, types of research, or even notable or interesting findings that have come out of your science that you'd want to chat about?
Yeah, sure. My lab studies emerging contaminants, and those things are either chemicals that are new to the marketplace or things that have been around for a while, and we just now are able to measure them at maybe the low levels that they're found out in the environment. And so some of the things that we've researched in the past are some of the pharmaceuticals that we use on a daily basis and end up going through the sewage treatment plant. They get removed to some degree, but they end up out in our environment. And we try to identify which ones do we have to be more concerned about than others. And so our research has pointed to a few different classes of medications that might be having impacts on fish populations. These include some of the neuropharmaceuticals that are released, so things like Prozac and some of the other things that we take for depression, anxiety, seizures, and other things have similar neurological functions in fish. And so what happens when you're exposed to a really tiny dose of that over a long period of time in fish populations? And that's one of the things that we're studying. Also, diabetes medications. So huge swaths of our population across the United States are on diabetes anti-diabetic medications, like metformin is one. And we've had some indication that that could potentially affect reproduction in fish. And so we're investigating that further. Definitely the energy balance, it's designed to regulate insulin levels in mammals, in us, but what does it do in a fish? And we're a little concerned that it might have some kind of impact on the energy budget of a fish to the point where it causes changes in their populations. One of the other great areas in our research, I mentioned it at the beginning, our scientist Sandra McClellan is looking at how you can monitor sewage and wastewater effluent and the environment after that sewage and wastewater effluent to determine what's going on in a population. So she's part of the group of scientists around the United States, around the world, that are looking at wastewater as an indicator for human populations, in this case for COVID. And for instance, where is the Omicron variant? Are we finding it here in our ecosystem? And that would indicate that it's also in our human population, maybe before we've even detected it medically in our hospitals and in our clinics. So that's those are just examples of a couple areas of research.
Yeah, very interesting. I hadn't heard about diabetic medication before. I've definitely heard pharmaceuticals. I guess that is a type of pharmaceutical, but I hadn't heard diabetic medicine specifically. Very interesting. I've definitely heard for a while about, how this can influence even the gender of fish, right? There's been fish that change gender or whatever it might be because of this stuff. One of the things I'm interested in also is the idea of research or science then making an impact, using that science to then address an environmental problem, a public health problem, whatever it might be. Are there any examples, of that happening up there with the School of Freshwater Sciences?
Yeah, but for an immediate example, I'll give you an example of, again, our scientist, Sandra McClellan, that was doing bacterial studies. Her research has impacted everything from local wastewater treatment to identifying which beaches need to be cleaned up. So, for example, as just kind of I don't know if you would call it a fun example, there was detections of some bacterial contamination in one of the rivers around here that was right next to the stadium for the Milwaukee Brewers. And they were trying to figure out where this came from, and using her science, she was able to trace it back to a piping problem in one of the luxury boxes in the stadium. And
Wow.
directly informed how they needed to fix that problem. But her research also has identified, we have beach closures that happen around the United States. Here in Milwaukee, they were happening quite often on some of the public beaches, to the point where people didn't want to necessarily use those beaches as a recreational point because they were worried about the contamination from bacteria. And she was able to identify that actually a lot of the bacteria from those beaches were coming from seagulls, and not necessarily from human waste. And in the places where they did find any kind of leaks of sewage systems, she was able to identify those, and they could clean those up or figure out where the pipes were that were causing that. But the seagulls, Milwaukee came up with an interesting solution where they basically hired dogs to run up and down the beaches to scare the seagulls away during certain times of the year where there would be populations of people there, and the amount of E. coli contamination dropped because of that. So that's just one example, kind of a fun example, a really direct example that we see here in Milwaukee of our research making an impact.
Wow. I was wondering in my head, I'm like, what's the solution for getting seagulls to stop visiting and doing that, and a dog running up and down the beach? I'm glad there's an employment possibility for my Labrador then, if ever we need to put her to work, because she would be all over that.
Yeah, exactly.
I'm shifting gears a little bit. I'm curious about the students, and what kind of mindset they have right now. What are their interests? What do what's driving them?
Yeah. Oh, we have a diverse population of students in our program. So we have in our professional master's program. I'll just brag on that for a second. We have like a 98% placement rate of students from our program going out in the world and doing stuff in water science. And they come in. Our first students. I remember this population of students in particular because we had a journalist, we had someone that came from business, someone that came from engineering. It was just a really, and then plus people that are traditionally interested in, environmental science and making a difference in protecting the environment. And so it was really striking to me, even just from the beginning, that we have huge diversity in why people come and study what they do at the School of Freshwater Sciences. And similarly, when at the end of the line, people are getting internships and then eventually jobs in a huge diversity of places. We have students that have gone into industry. We've had students that have gone into government positions and students that have gone into nonprofits. So we have students that are working for our local Wisconsin DNR on areas of concern cleanup in the Great Lakes. We have folks that have gone off and done toxicology research in Procter & Gamble and international flavors and fragrances. We have folks that have gone off to university positions. They want to be a faculty member like I am at another place and teach students in this area. So it's a huge diversity of students that come in, and also who we graduate. I'll also say that there are a couple of them that have gone to work in our local water industries, or little startup technology companies. So there's one of our first students is now working for a company that looks at solutions for monitoring water use in industry and also in people's homes, with the goal of making people aware of what they're using, so then they can decrease their water use in different ways. And there are other startup companies here in Milwaukee that also employ some of our graduates. So it's really exciting that, it's a diverse field, and also that our students are going into diverse places. We're really feeding a lot of different freshwater science interests in positive ways.
That's very interesting to hear students drawn from these different fields come there, build up their expertise, and then go out to a lot of different fields too. I think it shows how water runs through so many things in our society. My last question kind of gets at that a little bit too, and I think I got this from looking at your website and the idea that you talk about kind of your role in the global economy and the science that you do and these fields that you're associated with. Could you talk about that, just the place of your university and the School of Freshwater Sciences and this research in that big global economy?
Yeah. I mean, research in academic institutions is really a major player in the global economy in general, and definitely in the locations where they're found. You see that these, highly educated folks that are graduating from universities end up really feeding into industry and government positions in the surrounding area that can elevate that area financially. And so in one way, the research engine ends up feeding the economy of the local community. We have spinoffs that come off of our research that end up starting local companies or are bought by local companies or international companies in order to build science. And then as a more general concept, water is really important for all communities, not just as drinking water, but for our industry, for our transportation, for all sorts of reasons. And so any way that we can improve our water resources and manage them better will help feed the global economy and will help stabilize the global economy. And so it's really important to consider it in many things that we do. And I think one of the reasons that we started our Center for Water Policy is that water is not necessarily a major consideration for a lot of industries, for a lot of governments. And so it's really important to have that, not just have an emphasis on science, but have an emphasis on how water in general plays a role in society and how we need to consider it, and a lot more of the things that we do in general.
Yeah. Fantastic. Well, Rebecca, I'm glad that I finally caught up with you and had the School of Freshwater Sciences featured on here. I hope to visit one day when I'm up in that area and see the campus
please.
and what you all do. So, but yeah, thank you so much for coming on the podcast.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And I look forward to seeing you in person someday.
All right. Thanks.
Waterloop.
Thank you for listening to this episode. And thanks again to SpringPoint Partners for grant funding and to Hydroloop for sponsorship. Remember, you can support the Waterloop nonprofit media outlet at patreon.com/thewaterloop. To find all episodes, sign up for email updates, and connect on social media, visit waterloop.org.
Waterloop, Waterloop.